worst part about having a restrictive upbringing was my inability to create what I wanted to create. Because it wasn't just family members harping on me for daring to use a swear word in a book or make a reference to a character possibly being queer. It was the deeply instilled belief that everything I created was seen, heard, and understood by God himself. So I couldn't even make what I wanted to make in private, away from prying eyes, because God was always watching. God knew I wanted to create a gay character, so I had to hide him. In 2016, I wrote a book called All These Little Things. This was a cross-country adventure about two best friends reuniting after a decade of absence, both of them doing so under grueling circumstances. The narrator of the story, Alan Eberly, is a newly established author who had just discovered his wife is having an affair. His best friend, Paul McKenzie, is a wild child, polyamorous, cult-escaping heartthrob who's been burdened with a terminal cancer diagnosis. Together they traverse America, drink beer, and reminisce about the good times. Paul helps Alan learn how to live life just as his is ending. And in the end, Paul does in fact die. And that's the end of the book. And the end never really sat well with me. It didn't feel like Paul was the character he wanted to be. Back then I always knew Paul was queer. I knew he had a crush on Alan, but I could never let anyone else know about it. So I made him polyamorous instead. It was my only way of being able to tell the audience that he wasn't necessarily straight, even though he was still technically straight. He had two girlfriends who he breaks up with prior to going on his adventure with Alan, as he doesn't want to leave them burdened with a dying boyfriend. When I set out to rewrite the story last year, I swore the only thing I was going to change was his sexuality. I felt like that was the only aspect of the story I really wanted to change, and the rest of it could stay as it was. I ended up rewriting the entire book. Renamed it too. It's now called Ruby Bird, and it's part of an in-progress series called The Flight. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to inform you that Paul doesn't die at the end of this book. There will be spoilers in this video though, so fair warning. There's barely any part of this story that is reminiscent of All These Little Things anymore. The characters are different, their motives are different, even the stops on their road trip are different. Alan's name was even changed to Ruben because I wanted to be able to make a RuPaul joke at some point, and I ended up never doing that. I might still, I don't know. Shout out to my bestie Sparkles who suggested that in the first place. But the person who changed the most was Paul. He is no longer polyamorous. He's an out and proud gay man. He has history. He has trauma. He has issues with his megachurch running family who desperately want him to marry a nice Christian girl and paint pictures of Jesus and angels for the church to profit from. He has anxiety and self-esteem issues from growing up queer in a household that penalized and even abused him for showing any interest towards other boys. He had to develop two personalities just to survive. His true self, who he was able to be when he hung out with Ruben, and his Christian self, a quiet and reserved young man who towed the line and didn't show any signs of being anything other than straight. This split in his personality isn't present at all in All These Little Things. In ATLT, Paul is free to be himself with his family. His mother accepts him and loves him, and his father is just a simple preacher turned farmer man rather than the homophobic leader of a megachurch. In Ruby Bird, throughout the book we see every side of Paul's personality. We see the side of him who's a comedian, the side who jokes around and doesn't take anything too seriously, the side that doesn't always think things through before doing them. We see his flirty side, the romantic side, his suave nature and his sexual confidence. We see his loving side, the side that clings to Ruben like he's a warm fireplace on a snowy day, the side that desperately wants to be loved and adored and treated with tenderness and respect. We see his addicted side, his terrified side, the side who can't see any way out of the hole he's trapped in and has given up on life as a result. The side who believes he's worthless, unworthy of love, useful only for a one-night stand that will temporarily boost his confidence and make the pain go away. We see his despair, his regret, his guilt, his pain, raw and unfiltered and vitriolic and envious of everyone who ever had anything he wanted and never could have. He's artistic and opinionated. He defends his beliefs to the death, and he doesn't have a second thought about going to illegal means to get his points across. And through this dynamic personality of his, we get a very clear picture of who Paul is as a character. He's a scared little boy trapped in the body of a man who relies on his vices like they're a life raft in the open sea, but he isn't afraid to show that little boy to Reuben. And though he feels hurt by how they ended things years ago, he still sees one thing in him he can't find in himself: hope. When the duo find themselves at Paul's parents' home in the last chapters, Paul's personality flips like a light switch. All of a sudden he's withdrawn, at the mercy of his father's overbearing and commanding presence, and seeking the approval of his mother for the sake of her having a peaceful death. The man who once wrapped his arms around Reuben every chance he got is now hesitant to even look at him in his parents' presence. He pulls away from him every time Reuben goes to hold his hand. He keeps his distance from him. He does everything in his power to keep his parents from assuming the worst about him. The worst in this case being the fact that he's gay. Paul has an obsession with birds, and I used birds on purpose as a metaphor for his desire to fly away from life. Paul doesn't want to die, but he wants his pain to end. He wants his racing thoughts, his mental torment, his self-hatred to end. When he develops a tremor that's so debilitating it forces him to quit his job as a tattoo artist, it breaks him. It's the final nail in his coffin, and it's the straw that sends him tumbling into the hole. In Ruby Bird, Paul is no longer the victim of an aggressive cancer that's threatening his life. He's at the end of his rope in a long-standing battle with depression that's on its way to winning. Because before Reuben walked into Paul's life again, it was his goal to end things, on his terms, in his way, at his time. Ruby Bird is not just a story about two best friends reuniting after some unfortunate circumstances bring them back together after years apart. It's a story about pain, survival, heartbreak, addiction, depression, dependence, love, forgiveness, guilt, and hope. It's about two men finding each other in the depths of hell and trying their best to pull each other out of it. It's the story I didn't know I wanted to tell, but now it's the story I can't live without telling. It's the story I want to share with the world, and the story I will continue to share with the world, no matter who might be listening.